Now just know that somebody out there did not get the chance to be a goose this morning. So spread your wings out. Let's honk. The visual is awesome. Thank you for indulging me. Every one of us has had a toxic coworker. Maybe it was a fellow student or a colleague, somebody that you didn't choose to work with, but you got to deal with them daily. They may be somebody that you spend more of your waking hours with than your closest loved ones. There's Jenny, who told me about the coworker that she was working at a gym, and she had a coworker who in the evenings would go in and tell all the people who were coming, all the members that were coming into the gym, that the gym was closing. And so they didn't quite understand it as all the members dropped their memberships and went to other gyms. And the owners didn't figure out what was happening until they actually had to close the gym. How's that for a toxic coworker? Oh, and there was a supervisor who saw his role to be the gossip whisperer. He created a toxic work environment where people were divided, they were mostly annoyed, they were depressed. And eventually that supervisor left the company, found a job someplace else. But the legacy of harmful gossip continued, even when Anne inherited the new department.
Hear this ancient advice from the book of Proverbs. Without wood, a fire goes out. Without gossips, conflict calms down. Like adding charcoal to embers or wood to fire, quarrelsome people kindle strife. The words of gossips are like choice snacks. They go down to the inmost parts.
Anne was frustrated. Her office strife was actually driving sales down. Coworkers were sabotaging one another. She had people who would go into other people's files and change the numbers so that they would be embarrassed at work. And gossip continued to be like choice snacks in her department. And so she made an interesting, perhaps extreme, but a bold decision. She forbid people in her department from having lunch with one another. People had to eat in their cubicles alone. And she knew that because people had kind of learned to mistrust each other, it's not like they were going to be getting together in the evenings or on the weekends or anything like that. And she even went so far as to take the copy machine where people would gather and move the copy machine right by her office door so that she could shut down idle talk. She took the step to attempt to remove the fuel for the fire of office gossip. And it worked. Office gossip began to just burn itself out. And Anne's department really actually did. It started becoming more productive. And they pretty much started to coming into agreements. And pretty much to a one, everyone in her department decided that they really didn't like Anne. They saw her as a little dictator. Now, their assessment wasn't necessarily a fair assessment, because sometimes when you are confronting a toxic situation, it involves extreme measures. Sometimes you can't be nice and be effective. Jesus once told a story, a parable about coworkers. And you can hear this story from a whole lot of perspectives. And so listen closely to this story.
For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them back into his vineyard. About 9 in the morning, he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, "You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. He went out again about noon and about 3 in the afternoon and did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, "Why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing?" "Because no one has hired us," they said. He said to them, "You also go and work in my vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first." The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came, and each received a denarius. So when those came who were first hired, they expected to receive more, but each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. "These who were hired last worked only 1 hour," they said, "and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day." But he answered one of them, "I am not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last."
In this story, everyone is getting paid a living wage. Nobody's receiving non-sustainable income. The ones that work through the long hours, through the heat of the day, and those people who only worked for 1 hour. And we don't know, because the story doesn't really say, but maybe the ones who were chosen last until the last hour, maybe they just weren't as capable workers. Maybe they were older and they tired more easily and couldn't have worked all those hours in the heat. But everyone got paid a living wage. A denarius, think of it as a comfortable middle-class income for the ancient world. But is it fair? Do the complaining workers have a point? These who were hired last only worked 1 hour. 1 hour. And you, the boss, have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of work and the heat of the day. Is that fair? And is that just? Isn't this just going to lead to more strife and resentment from the coworkers? People have this conversation all the time. And you cannot tell me that you haven't heard someone who gets upset about somebody else who's receiving welfare. I remember I actually almost had to physically pull a guy off a woman. He was an older guy who had found out that a woman was receiving Social Security disability. And she referred to her check as her paycheck. And he got so mad because he worked long hours so that she could get paid for doing nothing. He was so upset. Strife and resentment. How does that figure into Jesus' parable about building God's kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven? It's tough. We are wired because we want things to be fair. And sometimes we have a boss who takes an interesting and maybe extreme, who makes a bold decision to do something like depriving people of being able to have their lunch in the lunchroom. We are wired because we want things to be fair, but according to our own assessment of what is fair. So on one level, you can take Jesus' parable here at face value. And you can imagine, you just got to come and accept that a higher authority is saying to you, take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do with what I want with my own money? And you don't have to like it. You can get frustrated. But can you accept that you're not the boss? And those are the rules. That's certainly an option. It can even be a moral option depending on the boss. It is a framework, a way of living that accepts authority. And that works for some people. They may not like the decision, but once it's made, they can learn to accept it. But there are those for whom that option just doesn't cut it. Actually, and I think there's probably a lot more people in our time and space that question whether there isn't even, who would even necessarily have moral authority to make a decision like that. Or, second, they may want to more fully understand the nature of the moral reasoning in order to evaluate the fairness of the situation for themselves. The justice, for example, of a strange, unworldly concept like the last will be first and the first will be last. That's an idea that goes against everything we're taught. And it's not just as simple always as accepting what the boss says. Because to evaluate that, to get into the morals of something like that, that level of moral and spiritual development needed to evaluate the concept of fairness. Fairness is very complicated. That takes time. And yet for those of us, if you're like me, you might even need to understand the moral reasoning of Jesus' parable. And if that's you, here's a start for you. This may help a little bit. You're going to have to unlearn some of the things you've been taught. You may need to consider that our usual way of doing business, the worldly assessment of fairness, it might be sick. That most of us are taught that the way that this world works actually promotes a toxic work environment that values people as if they were machines of productivity, and that all of us are in constant competition.
You are still worldly, for since there's jealousy and quarreling among you, are you not worldly? Are you not acting like mere humans? For when one says, I follow Paul, and another, I follow Apollos, are you not mere human beings? What, after all, is Apollos? And what is Paul? Only servants, through whom you came to believe, as the Lord has assigned to each his task. I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God has been making it grow. So neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God, who makes things grow. The one who plants and the one who waters have one purpose, and they will each be rewarded according to their own labor. For we are co-workers in God's service.
The Apostle Paul was going through a transformation here. When he wrote these words, there was something going on. The people that he was involved with, his community, was divided. Some of them preferred Apollos. Some of them considered them his people. And they were divided. There was a competition among these people about which one of these two guys had it right. But Paul was growing. He was growing in his understanding that Jesus offers an alternative worldview. It's a kingdom that works by different values, things that you have to unlearn. A kingdom that is good news for all people. Now here's the thing, I don't know where you're at on your journey right now. and how you respond to the question of fairness, of a God who would value people and pay people the same for different levels of productivity. But here is what I've come to believe, and here is what I proclaim. The good news is that we can be co-workers in a better world. We don't have to live in the sick world that we've been given. Strife and resentment that are driven by gossip and constant competition, this is not the way that we have to live. It is not the only option. There are alternative paths to the toxic environment of jealousy and quarreling that surround us. That path is available to you on many levels. What I hope you feel is that you are encouraged and committed to following the better one. You will find a sense of peace and a hope for the future that you will never find in the present toxicity. Amen.